Coming up on Arirang News, an audit finds suspicious transactions by 20 people in the area just outside of Seoul, where public officials are accused of speculating on land to be newly developed for housing. New data show the many ways the pandemic has affected people's lives in South Korea. Notably, there's been a perceived improvement in air quality. And Korea's top food delivery app, Baedal Minjok, has announced a gift of company stock for its delivery drivers and other workers, amounting to tens of thousands of dollars each. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The government and the Blue House have announced the results of the first round of an audit into alleged land speculation by public officials. They say they've found suspicious transactions by 20 people in the area where the government's planning to build new housing developments. Hong Yu reports.
The government has identified 20 people suspected of land speculation through their investigation of around 14,000 employees of the Land Ministry and LH, the Korea Land and Housing Corporation. Announcing the results of the first round of its audit on Thursday, Prime Minister Chung Se-kyun said most of the property transactions were concentrated in Gwangmyeong and Siheung, the area southwest of Seoul chosen for a major public housing project. The following round of audits will be on employees of local governments, rural public enterprises, and the local governments of Gyeonggi-do Province and Incheon Metropolitan City. To prevent future land speculation scandals involving public officials, the government will make sure those who have committed illegal activities are punished. Its headquarters for the special investigation on this scandal will also look into employees' partners and family members' property transactions. The government will also make a system to transparently monitor any acts of speculation by public officials. In response to the public having lost trust in LH, the finance minister will be in charge of reforming the institution.
The government declares war against real estate crimes. We will prepare and enforce special measures to sternly crack down on illegal and unfair practices in the real estate market.
The top office also announced on Thursday the result of the first round of its internal audit.
We have investigated property transactions of high-ranking officials and their family members, a total of 368 people, and there were no suspicious transactions at all.
The Blue House plans to investigate the rest of its employees and their family members, a total of 3,714 people, and announce the results as soon as the audit ends. Hong Yu, Arirang News.
New data show the many ways in which the pandemic has impacted people's lives in South Korea. It's taken a huge toll on jobs, especially in the service sector. But interestingly, the restrictions on business activities seem to have resulted in better air and water quality, or at least that's the perception. Kim Jae-hee has the details.
New data shows South Korea's employment rate fell last year because of the pandemic. According to Statistics Korea's annual report on quality of life released on Thursday, the employment rate last year for people aged 15 or older was 60.1%, a decline on year of 0.8 percentage points. The unemployment rate also continued to rise, up 0.2 of a percentage point last year to 4%. The survey also indicated greater fear of new diseases. Asked whether they feel safe from new diseases, almost 53% said they do not, an increase of more than 10 percentage points from a year earlier, reflecting the anxiety caused by COVID-19. But there was a rise in people's perception of air and water quality, it seems because of the past year's restrictions on business activity. Compared to 2 years earlier, satisfaction with air quality last year was up almost 10 percentage points to 38.2%, and with water quality up by more than 8 percentage points to 37.7%. Much of the data was from before the pandemic in 2019. For that year, there was a slight decline in overall perceived quality of life, which got 6 points out of 10, down 0.1 of a point from 2018.
Overall satisfaction with quality of life edged down slightly in 2019 compared to the previous year. Related indicators show an increase in the number of suicides and household debt. There were also more elderly people living alone and a rise in child abuse.
The suicide rate in 2019 rose to 27 in every 100,000 people, and the household debt-to-income ratio reached 190.6, which was the sixth highest ratio in the OECD. Last year, the proportion of households made up of one person aged 65 or older rose to 19.6%, having risen almost every year since data was first compiled in the year 2000. The rate of child abuse in 2019 surged to 381 out of every 100,000, an increase in the rate of more than 25%. Kim Jae-hee, Arirang News.
The Bank of Korea says it expects that inflation in the longer term is going to remain low for South Korea and globally. The break-even inflation rate in South Korea, the U.S., and Germany and Italy has been rising since March last year. The BOK said Thursday that inflation could rise in the short term as pent-up demand is released and as the economy recovers, but it said the possibility of a spike in inflation is limited because of the economic uncertainty that still exists due to the pandemic. The BOK said it's going to closely monitor the situation, especially in terms of the risk posed by rising oil prices. The U.S. House of Representatives has delivered the first major win for the Biden administration, passing the landmark pandemic relief bill worth $1.9 trillion. It passed on party lines 220 to 211 without the support of a single Republican. Most American households will get a payment of at least $1,400, with double that for couples and extra if they have children. The bill also funds the distribution of vaccines, unemployment payments, and help for state and local governments. President Biden is scheduled to sign the bill on Friday. The global semiconductor industry is projected to enjoy a surge in growth in 2021 as the pandemic has triggered a massive increase in demand for electronic devices. Semiconductors account for around a fifth of South Korea's exports, so it's shaping up to be a profitable year for Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix. Paeunji reports.
Global market researcher IC Insights has raised its 2021 market expectation for the global semiconductor industry. The researcher raised its forecast by 7 percentage points to give a new on-year growth forecast of 19%. The positive outlook is driven by a forecast of a 17% surge in IC unit volume shipments. IC Insights said that the pandemic has accelerated the digital transformation of the global economy and that it led to an increase in sales of new electronic systems. The research firm added that demand has continued in full force in the first quarter of 2021, projecting a 2% growth. The company said that if this happens, it will be the first time in 10 years that an increase has been seen in the first quarter. It also raised its projection on global semiconductor sales this year to nearly $480 billion, $27.5 billion higher than its previous forecast. Last year, the global semiconductor market had recorded sales of $404 billion. IC Insights is not the only researcher that has raised its market expectations. World Semiconductor Trade Statistics had also raised its market expectation for 2021 in December last year from 6.2% to 8.4%. It forecasted that the semiconductor memory market will grow by 13.3% and will show the largest growth in the semiconductor sector. Paeunji, Arirang News.
Korea's top food delivery app, Baedal Minjok, has announced a gift of company stock for its employees of 100 billion won, or around $88 million. Those who've been with the company since before the pandemic can get potentially tens of thousands of dollars worth each, and there'll be a significant amount for even the newest drivers. Min Soo-hyun reports.
Kim Bong-jin, founder and chairman of Ua Brothers Corporation, which runs South Korea's top food delivery app, Baedal Minjok, plans to give $88 million of stocks and incentives to its delivery riders and employees. On Thursday, the company said that it had sent messages to those eligible for the stocks. In a message, Kim said the efforts of the riders have truly made the company what it is today and thanked them for their hard work done so far. Around 1,700 employees and riders working for the company will receive stocks. On average, each employee will receive shares worth $43,000, but the actual amount will differ depending on his or her work period, meaning those who have stayed in the company longer will have a better chance of getting more shares. Delivery riders who are not employees of the company will still get a slice of the pie. Those who have been under contract for more than a year and who have delivered more than 20 items per day for 200 days or more can get between $1,700 to $4,400 of shares. Others, including new delivery riders, temporary workers, and fixed-term employees, will each receive cash payments between $880 to $1,300.
The stock gift has nothing to do with Chairman Kim's recent donation plans to society. He is disposing some of his personal shares to give out the stocks.
The company's plan, however, has been met with mixed responses. Some welcome the idea, while others say that it's not what really helps the delivery drivers on the road.
While I'm not eligible for this, as a rider myself, I think it's a good idea that the company is sharing the benefits with those who are working hard.
It doesn't really mean much. For people like us, the company needs to pay us more money for our delivery services. Giving stocks is just to show the public that the company is doing something, so this doesn't mean anything to me.
The company says that the specific details of these rewards will be made through text messages to the recipients individually. Min Suk-hyun, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Kim Se-won, professor of economics at Ewha Women's University. Professor Kim, good afternoon, and thank you for coming on today.
Good afternoon, Devin.
Well, let's start with the concerns about interest rates. The yield on the 10-year Treasury coming down from yesterday's peak to around 1.5. Still, some say it could be headed to 2% by the end of the year. What do you see happening with the rise in rates here?
First of all, recent ups and downs of U.S. Treasury bond yield is related to increasing inflation pressure. Whenever inflation rate changes, the same amount of automatically reflected in bond yield or interest rate. Yesterday, U.S. 10-year Treasury bond yield temporarily decreased down to 1.5% level from previous 1.6% due to U.S. government's 10-year Treasury bond sales of 38 billion U.S. dollars. But because of ample liquidity and economic recovery, U.S. inflation is slowly increasing from the end of last year. December of last year's annual inflation rate was about 1.2%, but it increased up to 1.7% in February of this year. So it is highly expected that inflation goes up by the end of the year with higher bond yields or interest rate in the United States.
The situation is affecting bond markets all over the world, of course, including Korea. Some concerned about all the debt taken on by the Korean government and others to fight the pandemic. What do you say, Professor?
Inflation pressure spreads out to almost every major economy, and Korea is not an exception here. For limiting the rise of interest rate, we have to stabilize inflation. But higher inflation is driven partially by higher production factor prices in oil, natural resources, and agricultural products. But Korean economic import most of these materials, which makes difficult to control inflation. And if government goes to another round of emergency relief fund, which is financed by government bond sales, higher interest rate will give a larger burden to taxpayers in the end.
Well, let's turn to stocks for a minute. Wall Street closed higher for the most part overnight, though not the big tech stocks. It was the Dow with a gain of almost 1.5%, closing at a new all-time high. What's the story in the global markets?
Before yesterday's U.S. market rise, U.S. market has been much more volatile than before because of higher U.S. bond yield which we talked about before. Dow Jones Industrial Average climbed more than 450 points or 1.5% to a record Wednesday due to lower bond yields and U.S. House approval on $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. But NASDAQ marginally dropped by 0.04% on Wednesday.
And in Korea, a solid gain today across the board. The Kospi now back above 3,000 and the Kosdaq back above 900. Tell us about the local markets.
The domestic market had a great performance today. Of course, it is affected by yesterday's U.S. market great performance. Actually, after having 5 straight day loss in domestic market, Kospi increased by 1.9% today, and Kosdaq also increased by 2.2% today. Particularly, foreign investors led both markets of Kospi and Kosdaq with aggressive purchase over 1.9 trillion won.
And I want to ask you about Korea's exports. In the first 10 days of this month, they're up around 25% from a year earlier. So we've seen a rise now for each of the past 5 months. What's driving the rise in exports?
Korean export is gaining more momentum over more than 5 months. And Korean export expanded by 9.5% last month, February, posting the best performance for a month of February in 9 years. In early March, export continued to increase by 25% compared to the same month in the last year. This month, Korean export increase is led by major export items of memory chips, 25% export increase, automobiles, 23% export increase, and petrochemicals, 28% export increase. For export destinations perspective, export to China increased by 34% and to U.S. 22%. As COVID vaccine is distributed over major countries, Korean export will continue to increase by the end of this year.
And before we go, Professor, I'd like to ask you about Korea's economic growth this year. Investment banks have raised their forecasts to 3.6%, the OECD calling for 3.3%. I believe that's even more optimistic than the Bank of Korea. So what do you think of these estimates?
I think OECD is focusing on South Korea's rapid increase of export, as we talked about before. So since South Korean economy is highly dependent on foreign export and import, over 70%, actually one of the most highly foreign dependent country in the world, recent export increase has a significant sign for recovering Korean economy. That export increase is reflected in adjusted OECD's economic forecast of this year up to 3.3%.
Got it. All right, Professor Kim, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, as always.
Thank you very much.
The United States says it does not intend to lift its sanctions on Iran until Tehran returns to compliance with the nuclear deal. And that means billions of dollars in Iranian assets will likely remain frozen in South Korean banks. Seoul is under pressure from Iran to release the assets and says it's continuing to talk with Washington about what can be done, which could be a topic for discussion when Secretary of State Blinken comes to Seoul next week. Yoon Jung-min reports.
The U.S. has made clear that it opposes the release of Iranian assets frozen in South Korea unless Tehran returns to full compliance with their nuclear deal. Speaking at the House Foreign Affairs Committee on Wednesday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the U.S. would do the same thing, meaning sanctions relief, if Iran comes back into compliance with its nuclear obligations. But he said it won't be getting the relief until it does that. Currently, Iranian assets said to be worth around $7 billion are frozen in South Korea under the sanctions. And apparently, to pressure Seoul to unfreeze the money, Iran seized a South Korean flagged ship in the Persian Gulf in January. Seoul's foreign ministry has reached some form of agreement with Tehran so that part of the assets can be used, possibly through the Swiss humanitarian trade arrangement, but making that actually happen would require consultations with the U.S. and other related countries.
We have been continuing and will continue our talks with related countries, including the US and the international community on the Iranian frozen assets in South Korea.
The matter largely depends on the prospects of Washington and Iran resuming their nuclear talks known as JCPOA. The Biden administration has pledged to return to the 2015 deal that the Trump administration walked away from, while urging Iran to return to full compliance. Iran, however, wants the U.S. to remove the sanctions first. Regarding the issues related to Iran, Seoul's foreign affairs minister could discuss the issue with his American counterpart Antony Blinken when he visits Seoul next week. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
The South Korean government has approved the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine for senior citizens. Millions more AstraZeneca doses will be arriving in the country in the next several weeks, which will be enough for 3.5 million people. Jang Tae-hyun reports.
The AstraZeneca vaccine can now be given to people in South Korea who are 65 and over. Prime Minister Jong Se-kyun said on Thursday that the decision was reached during a meeting of experts the previous day. He also revealed that more AstraZeneca vaccines are scheduled to arrive in South Korea in the coming weeks.
We'll be getting 7 million doses by the last week of May to June. We'll also administer those shots to people 65 and above.
As people need 2 shots, that amount will be enough for 3.5 million people. The vaccine's safety and efficacy had already been verified about a month ago, but at the time, there wasn't enough clinical data for senior residents. That meant those aged 65 and above were excluded from receiving the vaccine after the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety said such a move should be considered carefully. However, a recent study out of the UK has shown the AstraZeneca vaccine is effective for older people, and various European countries like Germany and Italy have approved it for older age groups. The Prime Minister said it's time to speed up the vaccination process, urging health authorities to give the vaccine to as many people as possible in the first half of the year. Jang Tae-hyun, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.